Hi, welcome to Literature Space, and this is the third episode of the history of English literature. We studied about the Old English period in last episode. Today we will take a look at Middle English period, that is the age before Chaucer. There are no particular dates to mark the Middle English period because we exactly don't know when the Anglo-Saxon period, aka the Old English period, came to an end. But it can be considered from the 12th to the 15th century. Yet, 1066 AD can be considered as the beginning of the Middle English period because that was the time when Anglo-Saxon dominance came to an end and the Normans took over England. The language used during this period had less Germanic influence and is easier to understand than that of the Old English period. The Middle English period can be divided roughly into the period before Chaucer and the period after Chaucer. And today we will be talking about the history before Chaucer. But some scholars also consider the beginning point of literature from the age of Chaucer. Unlike the Old English period, Middle English period was more about considering itself as an individual rather than getting influenced by other nations. Now the next important event in the Middle English period was Magna Carta. Magna Carta was a politically significant event signed on June 15, 1215, drafted by the Archbishop of Canterbury, agreed to by King John, and this was the time when England began to shape itself as a nation. Magna Carta was signed to make peace between King John and a group of rebel barons. It promised the protection of the church and protection of barons from illegal imprisonment. It is important to know about Magna Carta because it became a part of political life in England. It brought new secular ideas in England. Now let's talk about Middle English literature. We studied in the previous lectures that Old English literature was mostly about war and voyages, and these themes continued in the Middle English literature too. But moving forward, we also observe that there were romances coming into picture. These romances were not only about love between two people but also about knights, their courtly love and chivalry. There were also oral songs based on wars and romances. Again, like Old English literature, most of the works were anonymous. The books were quite expensive because they were copied in the form of manuscripts and printing was yet to come into existence. Most writers lived in London, which was the Norman capital. This was also the time when Oxford and Cambridge came into the light and were the centers of language and culture. Moving forward, let's take a look at some important works in 12th century. The first one is Ormulum by Orm. It is a religious and historical work and can be considered as an interpretation of the Bible containing the traces of the Roman conquest in poetic form. The next important work is The Owl and the Nightingale. It is known to be an allegorical work which is a debate between an owl and a nightingale which is overheard by the narrator. It is the earliest work of debate poetry. The poem ends with a debate unresolved and the owl and the nightingale fly off in search of Nicholas. Nicholas of Guildford is mentioned several times in the text but his character never makes an appearance. It shows the influence of French linguistic and rhetorical techniques. Now let's take a look at the works in the 13th century. Lawman's Brut, probably written between 1200 to 1205. Lawman's Brut is also known as the Chronicle of Britain. This poem is 16,096 lines long and is written in alliterative verse style. It describes the Roman conquest of Britain and the legendary brothers, Hengist and Horsa, who brought the Angles, Saxons and Jutes to Britain. After this, the story focuses on the myth of King Arthur. Wace's Arthurian Chronicles and BSP. This is another significant work of the Middle English period. The Romance language Wace wrote is regarded as an Old Norman dialect, a dialect of Old French. Writers in Jersey have looked on Wace as the founder of Jersey literature. The Roman de la Rose, also known as the Romance of the Rose, is an important work which has influenced the writing of the Romance in 14th as well as 15th century. Geoffrey of Monmouth. He is considered as a prominent figure. His most important work is called The History of the Kings of Britain or Historien Regum Britanniae. His work is said to be inaccurate, but he popularized the legends of King Arthur. Robert Manning of Brunn. He was another popular figure and a chronicler. His two notable works are Handlingsine and Manning's Chronicle. We also get to read the descriptions of his personal life and surroundings, which was out of trend during those times, as writers did not even take the credit of work they had written, and most of the works were anonymous. As we move towards the 14th century, we find the influence of Chaucer. This period was also known as the period of alliterative revival. There was also an important anonymous poet known as the Pearl Poet or the Gawain Poet, who was named after his famous poems known as Pearl Poems and his major work Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He is also said to be the contemporary of Chaucer, Gower, and Langland. We will be discussing these writers in the next class. Robert Cotton. He was an important figure because all the manuscripts that we read, such as Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, were collected by him in his manuscript called Cotton Nero AX in the late 17th and early 18th century. Speaking of language, during this time, there were 5 major dialects: Southwestern, Southeastern, East Midland, which later became Chaucer's language, West Midland, and Northern. Here are some notes from today's class. Feel free to pause the video and read. In the next class we will study about Chaucer because many scholars consider Chaucer as the real starting point of the history of English literature. Till then, read on your own and don't forget to like, comment and subscribe. You can also post your doubts in the comment section. That's all for today. See you in the next class.